welcome back to Earth Talks. First, a short announcement. We've had a little bit of a juggle of the schedule, which I think you will find to be welcome. One of our speakers who is scheduled to arrive on speak on April 15th due to international travel beyond our control can't make it. And our April 8th speaker agreed to shift to April 15th, which means that we will not compete with the eclipse on the afternoon of April 8th, which is happening right about this time of day. And I thought, especially for a bunch of Earth scientists, it'd be kind of silly to say, come sit in a classroom while there's a solar eclipse going on. I am not that kind of meteorologist. I cannot control the weather. Sorry. You'll have to talk to some of my colleagues upstairs about that. So if it's cloudy, we have kicked around the idea, maybe we should just get together and chat about what's been going on for the semester with the folks who are taking this as a class, and we can decide on that. If you'd like to do that, we could consider it. So we could leave it as a little bit of an unknown, but no speaker on April 8th. No speaker on April 8th. So that's a change. But other than that, welcome back to Earth Talks. And today I'm pleased to introduce Michael Bader, Associate Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Michael is also the director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative, a Johns Hopkins University initiative supporting equitable development for Baltimore and urban regions throughout the world. Professor Bader, continuing our study of what sorts of degrees do folks have that end up speaking in the series, which has been an interesting study. Professor Bader earned a bachelor's degree in architecture and art history from Rice University. That's a first for our group. And a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. He worked for 2 years as a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, that place that is commonly confused with Penn State. Then became a faculty member at American University, where he worked from 2011 to 2021 in the departments of sociology and public health administration and policy. He joined Johns Hopkins, and I only learned this looking up his CV, as an associate professor in the Department of Sociology in 2022. I didn't realize you were such a new arrival at Hopkins. Cool. He has published in journals that I have never encountered, including Sociological Science, City and Community, Journal of Urban Health, and Population Research and Policy Review. And he's now working with us on a publication for the Journal of Maps. So this is cool and different stuff. Michael will talk to us about today about neighborhood change, and let's welcome Michael to Earth Talks. They're all clapping here, honest.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Take it away.
Thank you, Kim, for such a nice introduction. Thank you, Ava, for organizing everything to make it possible for me to join you remotely today. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to a group, and especially with all the atmospheric scientists in the room. It's especially special for me personally, as some of Ken and Darren and others know. My dad's actually a climatologist, so it's like I've kind of come full circle in terms of my life, and so it's really a pleasure to talk to you today. I have a lot of slides. I'm hoping that two things. One, feel free. I don't know, Ken, if there's like a standard way that we do questions or if it's kind of interruptions. I find that I usually can't keep track of the chat, but I'm also happy to answer questions as we go, if that would be easier. I know discipline norms tend to vary on this, so I just wanted to confirm before I started.
We have generally been doing questions at the end.
Okay.
But if folks do want to, jump up and down and either shout out online or wave at me in here, I can pass the microphone out en route.
Okay, so, I'm happy to do them at the end. I just wanted to know.
We've been doing them at the end.
Okay, perfect. So I will plan on that, and then if I need to, I can go back to some of the slides. And as Ken, so with that, let me get started. So my own research, as Ken mentioned, is trying to understand how neighborhoods have changed, especially since the civil rights legislation in the 1960s passed. And so part of what I've been really interested in trying to understand are the very long, when you all are thinking about Earth scale, this is like a blip in time, but for those of us who are demographers thinking about 50 or 60 years of change is something that is, kind of stretching the limits of what we tend to think about. And so what I thought with the Earth Talks and thinking specifically about dynamics, what I wanted to talk about today is the dynamics of neighborhood change and classifying those long-term types of change to understand what is happening in American metropolitan areas. So my research focus is really in the United States. And then to make the case, and this goes to the negative space argument, which I'll talk about, is that where people don't move is as important as whether and when they do move. And so we tend to think about change as occurring when someone takes kind of a positive action to do something. And part of what I want to talk to you today about is, and try to convince you, or at least, I've been working on trying to convince folks, is that a lot of what happens is moves that don't happen are just as important as those that do. And this actually, I'm glad, Ken, you mentioned my background in art history and architecture. So this actually, the idea of negative space actually comes from art. And the idea is that when you have a composition, we tend to look at whatever is in the foreground, and that's called the positive space in art. And then the negative space is what's formed, and really good artists will be able to kind of to create art in a way that the negative space really shapes and helps you understand what's in the positive space. And so there's this famous examples where negative space is used in compositions, and so one of them is the two faces in vase. So if you look at the image that I just put on the right side of the screen there, if you look at the black part and look at that as the positive space, then there's two faces, and they form in the negative space a white vase. Alternatively, if you think about the white space as positive and the black space as negative, then you end up with a vase with two faces. And so the idea is that depending on how you compose and or think about a subject in art, then the negative space really is what informs and can, and as is the case in this image, literally create the positive space in the image. And so what I want to argue today is that thinking about where people don't move and the reasons they don't move there actually has a very profound influence on the dynamics of neighborhood change and the contemporary patterns of racial segregation that we see in this country. And so what I want to do is talk about two projects that are interrelated, that go together. One is a project that really corresponds to the first item that I have on here, which is classifying long-term types of change. And so I'll talk about some of the difficulties of why we would want to do that as demographers, and even as folks like those folks working on the Baltimore Social Environmental Collaborative, to understand the types and classify types of neighborhoods and the changes that are occurring in them. And then the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the dynamics that go into particular forms of those racial change that are really important to understand contemporary racial composition, and as I'll hopefully be able to come into you, rethink some of the ways we tend to think about these issues in urban settings. And so just as a little bit of background, part of what I want to try to make the case is that we've really had a transition when we think about racial segregation from what I call antipathy to apathy. So antipathy is the active effort to exclude people or to flee from them. So there was an actual animus toward people of color by white folks. And so if you think about kind of the postbellum period in the United States, so after the Civil War through about the 1960s, there were laws and policies that were written in law, de jure segregation, where whites could use legal and extra legal means to keep people of color out of neighborhoods. And so that period is, what we tend to think of, and I'll come back to this if folks are interested, but that's the period of redlining, of racial covenants, of the active exclusion of white folks the active exclusion of people of color, and oftentimes also Jewish folks, from neighborhoods in the United States. Following several Supreme Court decisions and policy changes, including the Civil Rights Act, there was a Civil Rights Act, sorry, particularly the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968 as a consequence or immediate consequence of Martin Luther King's assassination. White folks could no longer use those legal means to prevent people of color from moving to neighborhoods. And so the expression of their antipathy was to move and to flee. And then especially in the 1950s and 1960s, when there was a huge amount of housing being produced, there was a lot of places for them to go. And then what I argue is that starting in about the 1980s to 1990s, and I'll explain why that transition time is or why I think that's the time this transition occurs. We move from what I call antipathy to apathy, which is the issue that whites are no longer fleeing integration, but are no longer seeking it out. And that has profound consequences to maintain and perpetuate racial segregation in the United States in a way that we don't tend to think about. And so if we're thinking about policy responses to prevent flight, which is, from this earlier period, then we may actually be missing the mark on what's important to try to promote racial integration in the United States and the consequences of the kind of systemic inequality that occurs, which leads me to the point of why study racial segregation in the first place. And there's two issues that I think arise from racial segregation. The first is that it distributes economic and institutional resources inequitably. And this is one of the major reasons that we think about racial segregation and identify it as a problem. But if you think about it, that's actually, there's not any real reason we need racial integration for economic and institutional resources to be distributed equally. We could just make changes to our policies to distribute those resources equally. And so really, if we think about racial segregation and eliminating racial segregation as something that's important to distribute resources, and that's really basically saying what we really want to do is make sure that people of color can live around white folks because white folks tend to have all the resources. And that really doesn't do much to change the underlying structure of inequality that leads to those profound racial differences in the first place. And so, in some ways, it's not really the justification that I think is most important. What I do think is that if we maintain racial segregation in the United States, then it reduces the probability of building interracial relationships, which I think has profound consequences for politics and pluralist multiracial democracy, which is, as I look at it, one of the biggest, experiments in democracy and one of the ways that America stands out. And so by not having racial integration, we don't practice that those muscles, and that can lead to long-term negative consequences. And so I'm happy to talk about these more in the end. But to drive home the point that what I think is important is really trying to understand the dynamics that lead to people sharing space and the dynamics that don't. And so I'm hoping by the end of today's talk is to convince you that research and policies that we should think about, including those related to the consequences of climate change at local levels, that when we're thinking about inequality, we should really focus more on white avoidance and browning of suburbia, relative to, I should instead maybe a little bit too provocative, but relative to white flight and gentrification, because both of those latter two are important, but I think that they tend to get all of the focus, and really we need to be thinking about the former in order to understand that. So with that, I'm going to move to the kind of two research projects that I mentioned. First, I'll talk about the trajectories of long-term trajectories of neighborhood racial change. And so the problem, the kind of research problem we have here is that in the literature in sociology, from some of those journals that Ken hasn't heard of, but I promise are at least decent, is that there's kind of there's been the research showing there's kind of two divergent paths of neighborhood change. On the one hand, there's a growing number of racially integrated neighborhoods where multiple racial groups are present. So in the United States, for a variety of reasons, the largest racial groups that we measure are Asian Americans, Black or African Americans, white Americans, and Hispanic, Latinx, Latino Americans. And so what the research has shown is basically starting in the 1980s and 1990s, there's been this huge increase in the number of racially integrated neighborhoods that are shared among at least three groups and oftentimes four groups, where all four groups are present at levels that are comparable to their presence in the metropolitan area in which they live. At the same time, there's been a growing number of single race neighborhoods that have tended to be non-white neighborhoods. So there's a growing number of neighborhoods where essentially only Black folks are living in those neighborhoods, or only Latinx folks, and to some degree, only Asian folks are living in those neighborhoods. And so in sociology, there's a famous model called the invasion succession model, which for the ecologists in the room is actually based on ecology. It's a sociological interpretation of ecology, which says that if you have a neighborhood that is all one racial group, and a family or a household from a different racial group moves into that neighborhood, then eventually what you would see over time, due to the kind of satisfaction of the residents of the initial group, is they would oftentimes flee, and the houses that are left vacant would be especially attractive to the new group coming in. And so what you would end up with is complete racial segregation. And so that's what I try to depict here. And so that's the basic basic theory under which most of sociology and economics has operated to understand the patterns of neighborhood racial change. There's a contrasting point of view, which basically says that invasion succession occurs when there's two groups because of the dynamics of those two groups. But if you have multiple groups, like I mentioned, there's multiple groups, many more neighborhoods of multiple groups, there's this philosophy called racial buffering, which is that any group, but particularly whites, will be buffered from any particular non-white group, any group of color. And so as a result, neighborhoods will tend to remain integrated over time, and white folks won't flee. In contrast, there's another group of studies that basically says, no, that's not actually true. And in fact, what's happening is white folks are actually fleeing. It's just not happening fast enough to be picked up by the decennial census when we tend to measure these things. And so if you look over time, over the long run, what's going to happen is we're going to end up with potentially multiracial neighborhoods, but white folks aren't going to live there because of white flight. And so this brings up a couple different questions of really trying to understand what's going on over very long-term periods. Because if the idea is that the change is not happening fast enough to occur in a single decade, then we're going to need to measure the change in racial composition over 20, 30, 40 years. And so the research questions that I really want to focus on in the next couple of minutes are, what are the common types of neighborhood racial change? And where do those common types of neighborhood racial change occur, so that we can understand the geography of race and place in the United States in the 21st century? And so there's a methodological problem here, that on the one hand, we can measure multiracial diversity based on the presence in the neighborhood. And so if you basically say that if what we're only looking for is a binary, is a group present or not present, then we could combine all of the groups together and we can look to see who's present and who's not. And it's actually the studies that tend to do that find that racial composition stays relatively diverse over time. Alternatively, if kind of the alternative hypothesis here is that neighborhood white composition is changing over time, but the pace is relatively slow compared to white flight of the past. And so we would want to measure composition, but there's an issue because we want to be able to measure composition among multiple groups, not just a single group. So if we want to just measure the change in percent white, we can do that over time. But what we really want to do is classify neighborhoods not just on the percent white, but on the percent white, percent Black, percent Asian, and percent Latinx. And so to give an example of why these things are important, I've kind of drawn out 3 graphs on the right and described how I'm going to use what are called growth mixture models, which are non-parametric classification to try to classify different types of neighborhoods. So if you look at the 3 graphs on the right, what I try to do is graph racial composition from 1970 to 2010. And the kind of tannish area represents the share of white folks. The green part represents the share of Latinx folks. The blue represents the share of Black folks, and the red represents shares of Asian folks. And based on a kind of simple classification strategy, if we basically said that every group needed at least 10% of the residents to be considered present, we would say that the transition in all 3 of these neighborhoods was the same, right? So based just on the classification method, all 3 of these would end up as the same, because there's at least 10% of each group in each of the final, or maybe it's 5% with the Asian here. So each of these three neighborhoods would end up being classified as multiracial in 2010. But you can see that the change in what's happened in those compositions is very, very different. At the top here, it's basically this single group of classified as Black, that I said was classified as Black folks, basically became the overwhelming majority. In this case here, white folks left from 1970 to 1990, but then started moving back in 1990 and actually increased up to 2010. And the neighborhood down here at the bottom is basically still predominantly white and would still be considered predominantly white, even though there would be a presence of other groups there. And so what we want to try to do is classify the number of trajectories, identify the number of trajectories that exist, and then using the growth mixture models. And so, like I said, this is a non-parametric way of approaching this problem. I'm more than happy to go into the methods. I find that methods are oftentimes where people's eyes glaze over. So I will describe what it does, but if you want me to get into the specifics, I'm happy to do that. But the idea is that you set out K number of classes, and then you try to find the likelihood ratio, you try to minimize the likelihood ratio as you add classes to try to identify the proper number of classes. In this case, I'm going to call the classes trajectories because they're measuring change over time. And then I'm going to interpret the trajectories. And then one of the benefits of using this method is that every neighborhood that's included in the sample gets a predicted probability of being a posterior probability of being in each of the different trajectories. And so a perfectly classified system, if the model works 100% of the time, would classify one trajectory as being 100% probability of membership and every other one is 0. Of course, that doesn't happen because there's uncertainty in which class each neighborhood should get classified. So that's a way of measuring the uncertainty. Again, I'm happy to talk more in depth about any of these things, but that's basically what we try to do. And so what I'm going to do is use the most likely class that a trajectory that a neighborhood followed, and then be able to map those and describe some of the characteristics of those neighborhoods. And so I'm going to describe the data really quickly. So the data that I use is the neighborhood percentage of Asian, Black, Latinx, and white, which I've already mentioned. And then the data themselves are all census tracts in metropolitan areas with populations of 300,000 or more. And I'm going to measure change from 1980 to 2015. And I put an asterisk there for 2015 because the 2015 data actually, so there's 3 big changes that occur. And again, I'm happy to go into any of this, especially if the students are interested in using census data to figure out how to measure change over time. There's 3 big changes that go in. So one is that census tracts do not remain constant over time. So we use a method of geographic interpolation to assign different parts of tracts over time as they can get split, they can get combined, or they can have a combination of both. The second big change is that racial groups are measured differently. So starting in 2000, the census allowed people to identify with multiple races. Before 2000, the census did not allow that. You had to identify the race you most identified with. And then the third is that starting in 2010, the census moved away from having all of the data collected every 10 years to having what we call the American Community Survey, which is an ongoing survey of a sample of residents every single year. And then to get the estimates at the smaller levels of geography, they combine the results over 5 separate years. And so the 2015 here actually is the midpoint of the 2012 to 2017 5-year, the 5-year ACS data. So that's why that asterisk is there. And just to give you a sense, a census tract, there has about 4,000 residents in it. And the census tries to keep that constant. So it's a population constant measure rather than a geographic constant. And there are about 200 census tracts in Baltimore. For those of you who know Baltimore, there's 199 census tracts with population in Baltimore to give you a sense of the kind of scope of the size. So that's all the kind of background and methods. And so once we run these models, what I mentioned is that the first thing we need to do is identify the predicted trajectories of racial change. And so we identified 14 as being the number that minimized the log likelihood. And then we took those and looked at them. And I should mention that my colleague Enki Rastogi and I have worked on this together. We identified 4 groups in which those 14 trajectories fall, which I'm going to talk more about each of them in just a second. But just to give you an overview, there are 4 trajectories where the neighborhoods experience little racial change. There's 4 that experienced rapid racial change in the 1980s. There's 4 that experienced modest racial change, so the pace of racial change was much slower than those in the rapid racial change. And then there were 2 that we identified as having a reversal of racial change, which is kind of indicative of gentrification. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, and for those of you who, this is in the paper that I sent to Ken and Ava before. So I'm going to fly through these, but just to give you a sense, if you're interested in them, they're in that paper. So the first 4 trajectories are those that experience little racial change. And so unsurprisingly, there's one for each of the 4 racial groups. There's a white little change category, a neighborhood that had Asian little change. You'll notice the Asian percentage is not nearly as high as the white percentage. That's because Asians make up only about 4 to 5% of the US population. And in 1980 was almost 0%. I mean, it was closer to 0 than, or 1%, except in some metropolitan areas. So these neighborhoods here tend to be largely in very large cities like San Francisco and New York. There's a Latinx little change neighborhoods. You'll see that there was some increase, but these are neighborhoods that have traditionally been Latinx. And then as immigration increased in the 1980s and 1990s, really consolidated into being predominantly Latinx neighborhoods. And then there's Black little change neighborhoods where Black residents were the predominant majority. The predominant racial group and a large majority of residents. So that's a little change category. And the next category are those that experience rapid racial change. And so these are neighborhoods that experience basically the equivalent of about 50%. One group grew by about, grew between 30 and 50% over the course of the 40 years that we studied, or 35 years that we studied. And so there's a group for Asian growth from white neighborhoods, Latinx growth from neighborhoods that were once predominantly white, and Black growth from neighborhoods that were once predominantly white. And interestingly, this last group here are neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, where the share of Latinx residents grew, which was only about 1% of neighborhoods, but it is a growing kind of concern when we think about politics. So those of you who follow politics will know that in Los Angeles last year, there was a major controversy when between Hispanic and Black coalitions in LA when the Latinx group was disparaging folks, city councilors that represented the more Black areas of the city. And there's been tension in Chicago over redistricting of where aldermanic districts would fall and the ways in which Black and Latinx representation would rise and fall there. So it's an area that's interesting that really hasn't been studied that much, but is increasingly important for understanding relationships in US cities and metropolitan areas. The next group are neighborhoods that really you'll notice start to change in about the 1990s. You'll see the inflection point here where the population of some groups starts to go up really in the 1990s. And that's in contrast to the paths that I just showed, which really started in the 1980s or before the 1980s. So we can't really measure before. And here there's a Latinx growth from white neighborhoods, a Black growth from white neighborhoods. And so you see the rising share of red here, which represents the Black population, the purple here, which shows the rising share of Latinx on the left, and then the white share is decreasing over time. And then these last 2 are the kind of interesting places that I was talking about before, which are the places where the neighborhoods where all 4 racial groups are starting to live together, and they're relatively maintaining their racial composition. So they obviously, if a neighborhood was all white and it has all 4 racial groups, there has to be some period of change, but it looks like levels are relatively constant over the last 15 years of the study from 2000 to 2015. And so we would expect, if the trends continue in these neighborhoods, that these neighborhoods would be multiracially diverse over a very long period of time. And then finally, there's two types of neighborhoods where the white share of the population shrank or was what appeared to be shrinking and then grew. So on the left there are neighborhoods where the share of Latinx folks grew as the share of white folks fell. And then the share on the right of neighborhoods where whites were not a majority of the residents, and by 2015 were almost a majority, and those were neighborhoods that had once been predominantly Black neighborhoods. And so these are what we tend to think of in gentrifying neighborhoods, although gentrification is more of a class-based rather than racially based process. So what I'm showing, what I just showed you is basically what each of these trajectories are. And so now what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the distribution of those trajectories to understand what it is and where change is happening in metropolitan areas across the country. And so the first thing to do is to try to visualize. So I put underneath, try to visualize how common each of the different types of neighborhood trajectories are. And so these this types of plots are called tree plots, and basically the area of each group, or sorry, of each trajectory represents the percentage of the total area. Sorry, let me take a step back for a second. My throat is getting hoarse, and so I'm starting to try to talk fast. So let me try to take a step back. So the area of the plot here represents the percentage of each group. So you can see the white little change is the biggest block here. And if you remember, they made up about 43% of neighborhoods across the sample that I analyzed. And so the square here takes up 43% of the entire square of the plot. And so what I've done is outlined in orange those types of racial trajectories that were set in place under the kind of antipathy model that I've mentioned before. So these are neighborhoods that really were kind of set in their ways or had a strong presence of flight in them from 1980 to 2015. And so they take up the little change category, the little racial change category, and the rapid growth category, which are plotted respectively in teal and orange here. In contrast, the kind of new models of integration and what I'm going to argue is also some apathy that is leading to whites not being as present in these neighborhoods outnumbers the patterns of racial antipathy. And just as importantly, I think, given the kind of presence that gentrification has both in common, I mean, in kind of the popular media and in the academic literature, I want to point out here that the racial reversal part of this, so again, gentrification is both an economic and racial process, that even if we're just looking at the racial component right now and not the economic component, that by far, there's a far larger number of neighborhoods where the share of people of color is slowly growing and the share of white folks is slowly decreasing than there is of gentrification in, or the kind of racial change that we would expect with gentrification in the United States. And so to just put some numbers to this, together, the kind of legacy, what I call the legacy of antipathy, the long-term patterns of racial change that were set in place before the 1980s, made up about 2/3 of neighborhoods. And this kind of age of apathy, I talk about the newly integrated modest growth neighborhoods make up 31% and compared to only 5% that have this racial reversal where we predict the shares of white folks are increasing. And one of the other benefits, as I mentioned, is because we're able to classify the predicted probability of membership in each of these neighborhood racial change trajectories, we're able to map where those trajectories are. And what you can see here is a map of the Baltimore, Washington area. So just to orient you a little bit, the triangle, or sorry, the diamond at the bottom, kind of in the middle there is Washington, D.C. And then you can see Baltimore up to the northeast of the district. And you can see that the area in what is Montgomery County and Fairfax County has a large number of those multiracially integrated neighborhoods. Whereas in Prince George's County, you see a combination of neighborhoods that had rapid racial transition in the 1980s, and then outside of those, a process of kind of modest Black growth. And then in Baltimore, you can see that the pattern of racial change really follows the black butterfly and the white L. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the black butterfly are the kind of wings of it are the areas that stretch out from the center of the, from the Inner Harbor out towards the west and out towards the east, where the share of Black residents is very high and poverty is also much higher. And the white L is kind of the wealthier areas in Roland Park in central Baltimore and Charles Village, and then Fells Point and Inner Harbor down to the right over here. And what you can see that might be important for those of you who are not studying just the city, but studying the entire metropolitan area is these patterns that started inside the city are really following a geographic trend, so that the areas immediately outside those that rapidly transitioned in the 1980s are those that experienced modest growth in the 1990s into the present. And then the final thing that I wanted to mention with these is looking at the share of the population that is in each of these groups by race, and focus in particular on Black Americans and Latinx Americans. So what I did here is remade the tree maps, but rather than plot the share of neighborhoods, I plotted the share of residents of each race that lived in a neighborhood in 2015 in each of these types of neighborhoods. And so what is shown here are those where Black Americans live. And one of the key things I wanted to show is that there are a lot of Black Americans who live in two types of neighborhoods that may not get as much attention, but are really important to understand the context and the where Black Americans live. So one is actually a large share of Black Americans live in the white little change neighborhoods. And so this is one of those, I've been thinking about trying to use this for when I teach Bayes' theorem, that so the share of Black folks in these white neighborhoods is very small. It's only about 2% on average. But because they are so common, remember that 43% of neighborhoods, there are a lot of Black folks who live in those neighborhoods, because 2 to 3% times, almost half of neighborhoods means that a lot of Black folks end up living in these white little change neighborhoods. And in fact, there's more Black folks in the United States in these mid and large sized metropolitan areas. They're living in these white little change neighborhoods, which on the map I just showed are largely suburban, compared to the neighborhoods where we are thinking about gentrification as having occurred. So just thinking about what that looks like, again, here the numbers that I mentioned, or putting numbers to the pattern that I mentioned. And then if you look at Latinx folks, a very similar pattern occurs. So if we think about what this means for understanding neighborhood exposure, and in my case, really thinking about the racial health inequality, if we focus on gentrification alone and ignore the patterns of gradual racial change that are occurring in other parts of metropolitan areas, we're overlooking the experience of most people of color, especially Black folks and Latinx folks. And so the kind of racial reversal, if we're thinking about the entire population of Black folks, and we're trying to think about the exposure to different conditions which could cause racial differences in the population, the racial reversal trajectory can't actually explain that much variation because it's not happening that often. And folks who are living in those neighborhoods are not folks who are living in neighborhoods in those mid and large sized metropolitan areas are not very exposed to it because they're more exposed to some of the more suburban trends that I mentioned. And I think one of the things that may be happening in that case is that if we focus only on gentrification, we're missing factors in newly integrated neighborhoods that may be that cause stress. If you think about the kind of daily incivilities that being a substantial minority in a predominantly white neighborhood may cause. If we miss those factors, then we're missing their consequences on health. And then finally, if we focus on gentrification, there's a kind of larger theme here, which is it continues placing agency with white folks rather than others and people of color and where they're moving and thinking about where they're moving. So I'll leave that up here for a second. I'm going to pause for just a second, and I'm going to move to the second study that really does think about white flight and where we should be thinking about agency and the process of people not moving. All right, so that gives a background to the kinds of racial change that I've been exploring and looking at, and others as well. And so now I really want to get into the negative space part of this. And so what I'm going to argue is that white flight actually does a pretty bad job of explaining why neighborhood racial change occurs in the 21st century. And in fact, what would be a better way to think about racial change in the 21st century is what I call racial cohort change. And so to start, I'm going to go back to the slides I just mentioned and say, I mentioned that the kind of second biggest group of neighborhoods were these neighborhoods that experienced modest racial change, where the share of white folks was declining over time. And so you see the share of white folks in the teal colored area of the plots here. You see that it's going down over time. So white, and the kind of reaction is, well, white flight must still be occurring if white population is decreasing. And so this is where I really want to think about dynamics. And I think that there's could be potentially some interesting overlaps between thinking about dynamics in populations and dynamics in other aspects of research that many of you focus on. So going back to Demography 101, if you were to take, the class taught at the Population Research Institute at Penn State, they would teach you the very first week, you would learn one thing, and you would learn one thing only, and is that population change comes from four components. It comes from births, which add to the population. It comes from deaths, which subtract from the population. And then you need to net out what we call net migration, which is the number of moves out of a neighborhood into a neighborhood and the number of moves out of a neighborhood. And so basically what we've been doing is, if we are attributing that entire change in white folks and the loss of white folks to white flight, then we're really only saying that all the changes occurring with that last component, the white moves out. But that would be fine under a couple conditions. So one is, that's fine if moves are happening so fast that basically births and deaths don't have a chance to occur. So births take a while to happen, right? At least 9 months gestation, and then longer trying to get to that point before then. And then deaths, occur over someone's lifespan. And so, it takes a while for that to happen, and hopefully more than a decade for most people who live. And so if you're kind of measuring change from decade to decade, if the change is so fast that basically you go, as was the case in many neighborhoods in the 1950s, you went from almost 100% white to almost 0% white, there's no way that births and deaths could explain any part of that component of change, right? So we could ignore it then. The other way we could ignore it is if the age structure across neighborhoods was the same. So basically, if the probability of someone having a kid, what we call fertility, or someone dying, what we in demography call mortality, was the same, which tends to correspond to age structure more than anything else. And so if the age structure across neighborhoods was the same, then we could also ignore the natural component. Well, we know that as I just showed, the first is already kind of nullified because I showed that the change is happening very gradually. And so let's look at the second one, the second assumption there, which shows that, in fact, the age structure of neighborhoods is highly correlated with the racial composition of the neighborhood. So across the bottom of the graph here is the neighborhood percent white going from 0 to 100%. And what you see is that white residents are actually much older in neighborhoods where there are few whites than in neighborhoods where there are a lot of whites, with a small exception for those that are basically over 75%. And so we can't assume then that that we can ignore the natural component of change, because we need to account for the fact that there are births and deaths happening that are going to influence the population change at the end of our period. The other thing that has tended to be ignored is moves in. And so it might seem weird to think about moves into a neighborhood if we're thinking that white folks are declining in population share. But what I'm going to argue is that whites, and there's a whole bunch of research behind this that I can talk about, but whites are not that likely to move out because people of color enter neighborhoods, or at least that's what I'm proposing. But at the same time, they're also not as likely to seek integrated neighborhoods if and when they do move. And so if you think about two neighborhoods, right, that are all made up of white folks, they're both made up of white folks, there's going to be some share of white folks who move for all kinds of reasons, right? People get new jobs, they get married and take two households and form one. They get divorced and have one household and make two. There's all kinds of things that happen. And so there's going to be some baseline rate of mobility that's going to happen across neighborhoods. But if in one neighborhood, the houses that are left vacant are filled entirely by white folks, it'll look as if no change had happened. In contrast, if in the other neighborhood, half of those residents, half of those households that were left vacant were filled by people who are not white, then the share of white folks is going to decline, even though there are actually more white folks moving in, or there are white folks moving into the neighborhood, not just moving out. So in-migration and the relative rate of immigration matters as well. So when we think dynamically, the share of white folks at any given time is due to both moves in and moves out. And so there's kind of two natural counterfactual conditions that we want to consider. One is what would happen with natural growth if what would happen if no whites moved, and then what would happen in baseline mobility. And I'll talk quickly about the first one and then move to the second one. And so in order to try to go about this, the slides aren't advancing, sorry. Basically what I try to do is project the populations. I'm not going to go into the technical details right now, but basically what I use is a demographic method to try to predict the population if all we had was births and deaths, which I call the natural growth counterfactual. There's a lot of animations here. And then I compare basically the components of change over time. And so what's important here is this graph here, which shows that basically the change in white percentage, so the total change is this solid line that goes down and then back up again. But what you can see is the share of the population, the white population, that is change made up of both natural change. Because of that older age population that I mentioned in neighborhoods that are less white, you have many more people dying. So about 5% of the population, white population, is dying every year if in neighborhoods where whites make up less than 1/5 of the residents. In contrast, the fertility rate is leading to increases in those neighborhoods where whites make up at least 40% of the neighborhood. And so there is this change, and then there's a big change, a big difference in the components of change by the racial composition. So these are the groups who are present in the neighborhood, so white, black, Hispanic, Asian, white, black. And what you can see is that there's a large variation depending on what type of racial composition occurs. And so, is present, what type of change occurs. And so you can see that the natural change here is actually largest in the white, black neighborhoods. And so rather than thinking about all of the flight out of white, black neighborhoods as being due to moves, a decent number, about 12% of the losses in neighborhoods that are the least white, where black folks are the other group present, about 1 in 8 white folks who is lost due to death, not to migration. And so I'll skip over this real quick. So then the other thing we can do is look at the baseline mobility that I mentioned. And so what I did here was take a national survey of all white folks, or this representative white folks living in the United States, and basically saying at each age group, what is the probability that they move? And so I'm going to plot that in these kind of shaded areas here. So if all white folks moved out, that moved at the kind of baseline rate that all 20 to 24-year-olds moved out of neighborhoods, then and no white folks moved in, you'd basically have no white folks in the neighborhood. In contrast, what we actually see is there are more white folks who are ages 20 to 24 living in neighborhoods that are composed only of white folks and black folks than we would have projected based just on births and deaths. In contrast, those that are 35, basically in their 30s and 40s, are lower, but still not nearly as low as we would predict based just on the baseline mobility rates. And so when we think about the dynamics as whites age in place, I like this term that the stasis does not mean stability. And so basically what's happening, I argue, is that whites are aging in place as people of color are moving into white neighborhoods and integrating the neighborhood. But the population momentum, because of the age composition of when people tend to move and when they tend to, and where they tend to move, and they tend to move to whiter neighborhoods over less white neighborhoods, that you end up with this population momentum, which will lead towards segregation in the long run. And so there's this great quote by Karen Lacey, who is actually on my dissertation committee, who says, "A research agenda for the sociology of suburbia must be as attentive to the browning of suburbia as scholars have been to process white suburbanization in the post-World War II era." And so hopefully, having to rush through this a little bit, I've convinced you that, we should think about white avoidance, the browning of suburbia that Karen mentioned, in addition to, or even potentially more than white flight and gentrification when we think about neighborhoods, and just thinking about some of the implications of this for long-term racial change. If we're thinking about positive interracial contact because of this racial cohort change I mentioned, it also implies that we need intergenerational contact. The age-based distribution of resources could exacerbate racial tensions in neighborhoods, and that whites will be politically overrepresented just because of the voting age. So because so many people of color in integrated neighborhoods are under the age of 18, they actually have less voting power than white folks do. And so hopefully I've convinced you, as I mentioned, that the negative space of thinking about where people aren't moving is just as important to thinking about contemporary dynamics as the historical legacy of racial segregation and the contemporary process of gentrification. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah.
I'm going to get into a mode where I can watch the chat as well as the room here. Questions for Michael? Could be on chat or from the room, or if you're online, you just want to speak up, you can. We have one question here in the room.
Hi, Dr. Bader. Thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. I have two questions about the group-based trajectory modeling.
Yep.
First, I was wondering what else you controlled for in the model besides the racial characteristics of the neighborhood. And additionally, I'm wondering how you measured race within the tracts.
Okay, so let me answer the second one first because it's easier. So I mean, it's not easier, but I'm at least basing on what other people have done before. So race as a concept changes over time and measurement. And so the way that we measure race is through the census. Each person identifies their own racial identity. And as I mentioned, in 1980 and 1990, residents were allowed to pick one race. Now, in the United States, we consider Latinx and Hispanic heritage a ethnicity rather than a race. And so all people who identified as either Latinx or Hispanic were considered Hispanic regardless of their race. That's how the federal government tends to classify people. And so if you do not classify yourself as Latinx or Hispanic of Spanish origin, I forget the exact, it's Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish or of Hispanic origin, then you are classified based on your race. And so the way that we used traditional concordance, which is suggested by this, it was suggested by the Census Bureau to try to maintain backwards compatibility. So I can go into it if you want, but it's relatively complicated. So if people selected multiple races, it was a way that they looked at historically how people who would have said that they were one race, how they then answered the same question when they were given multiple races. And so there's suggestions for how to do that. All of that is reported in the census. So then I just took the number of residents that were Black, white, who identified as Black alone, that were non-Hispanic, Asian alone that were non-Hispanic, and white alone that were non-Hispanic, and Latinx folks of any race. And so that's the racial composition of the neighborhood. Does that make sense?
Yes. And then
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I know I had another question about what was included in the model, but before I forget, I also was curious about with the group-based trajectory modeling, if you noticed any trends as far as where the neighborhood classifications fell within like the geography of the United States and cities within the United States.
Yeah, so that's so actually the so yes, I don't have all of them off the top of my head. I do have some things that I know off the top of my head, but the region is something that's important. And so, well, let me take a step back. Sorry. I didn't control for anything else in the trajectories because what I wanted to get is basically use these classifications as the outcome variable. And then I wanted to use other characteristics to predict which trajectory a neighborhood followed. So it actually gets more kind of to your second point of where these things occur. And so a couple of things that that have stood out. One is that almost all of the Asian trajectories involving large shifts in Asian population, except for the multiracial trajectory, were on the West Coast. Or sorry, the Western region. It's not the West Coast. It's a Western region of the United States. The rapid change and the long-term segregation tended to be more likely in the Midwest and the Northeast. And the multiracial change tended to happen in places that were where the housing construction in 2015 was the places where a larger share of the housing units were built after 1968, which is when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And so I think a large portion of what's happening is that the policy that we enacted in the United States is actually having some effect. And so where there's the most multiracial integration in metropolitan areas is where housing construction is relatively new, and people of all races have the opportunity to move in at the same time.
I see that Olin Hall has its hand raised.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay, great talk. Thank you so much. My question is also about the racial trajectory neighborhood study. And I was wondering what other, if you included other census data in those racial trajectories, specifically like median income or education level, and if so, if there was anything surprising.
So again, so I didn't include, so the idea that I was trying to work on is basically trying to use the trajectory models to create an outcome variable. So I didn't want to include anything else in the model because then basically I would have the predictor and the outcome on both sides of the equation. So I don't want to do that. So basically what I'm doing is trying to create a classification system so the 14 different trajectories would end up as the Y variable, and then I would predict it with things like income and education. So I haven't looked at income yet, but education, the higher education tended to be in neighborhoods that were where there was little white change, but then also the highest educational attainment. So basically looking at this is the share of residents who have the share of residents who are 26 or older who have a BA or higher. So basically people who have 4-year college degrees were the highest in the multiracially, the kind of multiracial neighborhood trajectories where Black, Latinx, and Asian groups were all growing at a similar rate.
Thank you. Any other questions online or in the room? Oh, 2 here. I'll go here.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just had a question, generally speaking, based off of your methodology and the way that you've conducted research, maybe you would have an answer to the question of whether the socioeconomic factors influence where people migrate within cities, or whether it's the vice versa of that, whether where people migrate in cities influences like socioeconomic factors.
Yes, that's my answer. Yes, they both do. There's been a lot of research, not my own, but by other economists and sociologists that basically show that the share of people in the United States moving across counties, so kind of long distance moves, which are those that we tend to expect, follow economic change. So, you kind of think about the Great Migration, or think about the kind of moves west, during, the late 1800s and early 1900s, that basically those have been slowing since about the 1980s. So that long-term moves have changed. And so that most of the mobility that's occurring now is occurring within metropolitan area rather than across metropolitan areas. And even within the same county, which is really, pretty interesting. So that tends to lean more towards kind of other factors influencing where people are deciding to move rather than large scale macroeconomic conditions. And there's a whole bunch of, research and thoughts about that. Now, that being said, within a metropolitan area, there are certainly differences by socioeconomic status of which neighborhood one might select to move to within a metropolitan area, and that there's a large correspondence by income of where people would move and educational attainment. Those two move in parallel, but don't in interesting ways. So there's a lot of research, for example, that shows that the gentrification that's occurred in large cities are people who are highly educated but have relatively low incomes. So people who are kind of working for relatively low. So they're not low, they're relatively low, relatively education of the residents. So those are people, and so there's been a lot of work on kind of people who work in nonprofits and education and healthcare that move to gentrifying neighborhoods. But the other big component there is race, and that's another part of the research, my own research, what I talk about today, is that more so than anything else, and especially among white folks, race really determines where people would consider moving. And so there's kind of white folks already select out large portions of the metropolitan area where they would never consider moving. And then among those kind of decide based on things like income and education.
Yes. Thank you again. This is a great talk. So I'm really interested because I work in kind of the structural racism and health field. So segregation has probably the most used measure of structural racism in our literature. So I'm really interested to see how you think like living within these neighborhoods that experience these different trajectories may then influence like health and mortality.
I love that question. Thank you. We have a whole another hour for another. So I think there's a couple things that are really important to think about as we're thinking about those ideas. So one is the trajectory is keeping in mind the different trajectories overall when we're thinking about the entire population. And so that's part of why I emphasize the gentrification, because gentrification is something that's relatively easy to see. There's kind of conflict, there's stories about it. But one of the things I think we were really missing when we study health inequality is what my committee member Karen Lacey mentioned is Browning suburbia. So we know that that the areas where segregation is increasing tend to lose things like doctors' offices, hospital beds, pharmacies, grocery stores. And so if we're thinking about the processes that lead to health inequality, then really trying to understand the kind of long-term, slow, not super dramatic, doesn't make the news a lot, but really understanding what's happening in the kind of near-in suburbs in places like Prince George's County or the northwest suburbs out the Liberty Road corridor in Baltimore that are experiencing racial change that are not kind of as flashy or don't get as much attention, in part because they're in the suburbs and not in central cities, and in part I think because the process is relatively slow. And so I think that that's one thing that we need to consider, is the kind of institutional story. The other is the effect that I think there could be a different effect for people of color who are living in neighborhoods where they may still be the numerical minority, but where their population is increasing, of experiencing things like daily incivilities, racism, microaggressions that can all lead to things like cortisol response that could increase stress, from increased stress and lead to cardiovascular disease. And so I think that those may actually be very different by the type of racial trajectory that's occurring, and by not looking at across the population and by only selecting on something like gentrification, we're going to miss those ways that inequality creeps in.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
We should probably call it a day. Thank you very much again, Michael.
Yeah.
Wonderful
Thank you
talk.
all. It's great to have this opportunity, and thank you for coming.